Our next speaker is the last speaker in favour of the motion. To remind you again, let them come. We have nothing to fear from high levels of immigration. He is the multiply award-winning columnist, and since this appears to be fashionable these days, a former member of the Communist Party. It's important. A columnist for The Independent, The Guardian, The Observer in the past, and now for The Times. Please welcome, as I say, the last speaker for the motion, David Aaronovitch.
Thank you. In a way, it's odd that we, on this side, are proposing the motion, because according to the polling done by the Conservative Lord Ashcroft, significant polling, is a very big funder of good political information, about 17% of the country and no more supports the proposition of the motion. About 60% would support the opposition to the motion. And in a way, you've got to ask yourself why it is that we are having to propose a motion and the opposition are not proposing instead their motion, which is that mass immigration has been bad for Britain. Incidentally, before we go on, I wasn't aware that there was such a thing as a Vietnamese manicure and an English manicure. I presume on the Vietnamese manicure they give you little pictures of Ho Chi Minh on the cuticles and so on, or is the only difference the price, Harriet? Is it just the price?
It's price.
So it's only the price. The only price difference between the Vietnamese manicure and the English manicure is the price. That's begging the question why you didn't go to the English one if you felt that strongly about it. But nevertheless... What I'm saying is I think it would have been much more difficult for the opposition to be the proposition, which is to prove to you that mass migration had been harmful. We've already heard that the best case, really, that the opposition can make is that the economics are neutral. They grudgingly will admit that there is a significant amount of benefit, and yet we know that the polls show that the vast majority of British, or a large majority of British people, think that mass migration has been harmful. In other words, they've somehow absorbed a message that even the opposition to this motion don't accept. No, it's not just exactly, David, precisely going to be my point, and we will get on to your notion about what else it's about in a moment. It's not just about economics, it's not primarily about economics. A lot of people think it is, but in fact, it isn't, because we can agree that by and large, at the very least, there has been some benefit to migration, and I think that Susie and Ken and I would argue that the figures actually show that there has been significant benefit to this country from mass migration and significant benefit in terms of innovation, and also in terms of that thing that it's strange to find the right not believing in anymore, in terms of competition. Remember competition. If you face competition, the idea is you improve. According to the opposition of this motion, as I've understood them, if you face competition, actually you give up. That's actually the model which we're supposed, which is an unusual model to discover people on the Conservative side of the argument, David, are actually supporting. Nevertheless, the next thing that we can dispense with are the things which are essentially are myths about immigrants, which people believe, which we know are not true, and which, by and large, the opposition have not tried to peddle to us, which is to their credit. Myths that immigrants are more likely to claim benefits and so on. In fact, there seems to be, and this is not very surprising, because by and large the people who migrate tend to be more motivated, they tend to be younger, thus they help us out with a demographic problem, maybe in the short term until we need new groups of immigrants, but nevertheless they do, because by being younger they're more likely to be in the income tax bracket and therefore to pay taxation, and they're less likely to claim, and indeed that appears to be the pattern. They put more back in than they take out, and they contribute more than people who are not migrants. This is not an excuse, incidentally, for deporting non-migrants out of the country on the basis that they don't contribute enough. Although, actually, if you take David Goodhart's position that what we need to reach is a situation of net migration of 80,000, one way in which you could get to a net migration of 80,000 is by deporting a few more people who are already here, and that would bring your net clearer down to your figure, which just shows how ridiculous net migration figures are, one way or the other. I mean, how utterly, completely arbitrary and absurd. But as David says, this is not just about economics. nor is it about the myths. What you've discovered recently is that far from being too dim and bringing the educational level down, which was what used to be said about migrants, they are now too clever, and as a result, people can't compete with them significantly and so on, and it just isn't fair. Instead of being shirkers, etc., and coming over here for our National Health Service, it turns out that actually they don't shirk anything like enough, which means that you get to the appalling position whereby an employer faced with an illiterate ex-gang member on the one hand and a Pole on the other makes the lazy decision to employ the Pole. Whereas, according to Harriet's notion, if the Pole weren't there at all, the employer would heartily and immediately endorse the illiterate former gang member. Well, here's the question. No, you can't. Here's the question. Would you? Is that what you would do? It isn't, which suggests that actually we want to locate this problem somewhere else. And I hope to come to that before I finish my speech. So we next come to the, if you like, the nub of David Goodhart's objection to mass migration. He says it's a matter of the speed with which it's happened. And let's start, first of all, by remembering that this, of course, is not about race. You used not to be allowed to talk about immigration because you'd be called racist. Now, you can't suggest that anybody who's opposed to immigration does so partially because of race. You're not allowed to say it. It gets people extremely cross. And yet, when I turn to David's own book, I find a section right at the beginning about the speed, not with which there are a number of migrants into this country, but the speed, and he referred to it, with which we are going black. This is a demographic revolution, says David. Why is it a demographic revolution? Because according to the ONS, census of 2011, the population of England and Wales that was not white British in 2011 was a fraction under 20%. But by the time of the next census in 2021, the visible minority population, the visible minority presumably being, David, people who don't look like most of us look, yeah? People of non-European background, as the visible minority, will have risen from 14% today to around 20% for England and Wales, and a few years later for the whole of the United Kingdom. That means, says David, the visible minority proportion of the population, including people of mixed backgrounds, will have trebled in just 25 years. To which my immediate reaction is, so what? So what if they have? And those would include, for instance, my mixed-race nephew and my two mixed-race sons and daughters of my other nephews and so on. And presumably that will also go for a large number of people, a number of people in this room as well. It is hard for me to see this as being itself a problem. But David then goes on, London remains around 57% white, including non-British whites, and 43% visible minority, but we'll also certainly, almost certainly, be majority visible minority by the time of the next census. And he says if Britain had a clear and confident sense of itself, that wouldn't be a problem, but since it doesn't, then it actually is. In other words, well, the problem here is the speed with which we're turning black. If we could just turn black a little bit more slowly, then in fact, we would like it better. And yet, this is not a conversation about race. It is, of course, partially a conversation, not entirely, but partially a conversation about race. But as the discussion about vocational training proves, it is actually about something else as well. Today, we've seen the bringing in and the introduction and the publishing of the immigration bill. Now, the interesting thing about the immigration bill is it seeks to solve a problem we don't have, i.e. that there are lots of immigrants using our services beyond what other people do. It also tries to tackle the problem of illegal immigration by making people like landlords and hospitals, etc., check people's status before they take them on. And incidentally, I do hope you were asked about yours before you came in this evening. I really do. I wouldn't like to think that there were any illegal immigrants taking places in this hall away from perfect legal people. I think we should all do our bit, I really do, to make sure that none of them get in. Any illegal immigrants here? Put your hands up. Out. Go. Off you go. Ridiculous. But it isn't really about that. It's a cynical bill. It's a cynical bill because actually the very people it's targeted at don't believe it will work, and the government introducing it doesn't believe it will work. They simply want to tell those people, including Nigel Farage's voters, that actually it's safe to come back to them and vote for them. It won't actually have any effect on immigration. Actually, I'm pretty sure that Nigel Farage will say the same thing in a moment's time, but actually when he does, it will be self-serving, except when I do, it's not, OK?
This time is very
But
You're going to have to...
I just want to finish with what Lord Ashcroft said at the end of his report, because it struck me as being true. The reason why immigration has become so important, he said, people's concerns about immigration are part of a bigger set of anxieties. They see the pace of change continuing and even accelerating. And they know Britain in 20 years will look different from the Britain of today. It was very interesting that all David's examples about major change actually did not involve immigration at all, as it happens. And they know Britain in 20 years will look different from the Britain of today, let alone that of 20 years ago. Some welcome that, many are ambivalent, and others are scared. In the end, migration is inseparable from global economic conditions. Governments appear as powerless to manage the first as to deal with the consequences of the second. What this motion invites you to do is to see the benefit of immigration, but not join with those who say that somehow or other the problem of change is mostly a problem of immigration. It is not. It is a problem of a people adapting to the new, and we don't help them to do it by pointing the finger of blame at people actually who are not responsible. Vote for the motion.